So, hey, it's another episode. I've gone on this little run here lately of a lot of films from the 80s into the early 90s and primarily focused on the genre of like the post-apocalyptic wasteland and the dystopian future, because there's just a whole wave of films from that time period, all the way really from like the late 70s through, I guess, the late 80s, maybe just dipping into the early 90s. And I think it's funny because when you look at the way either technology or just filmmaking in general has evolved over the years, like there is a point after Star Wars in 77 where everybody wanted to do something like that. Everybody wanted to either copy it or just take big, ambitious swings like that, right? And of course, not really understanding the magic of how a particular filmmaker makes their film, you do what you can with what you have. And hopefully you get close or you surpass it, right? And I think what we saw there in the late 70s, all through the 80s, was you saw a lot of filmmakers and writers and performers that were trying to do something to match that success, right? They were trying to chase that particular target. And so you have a lot of copycats. You have a lot of films that just don't even get close. And yet, there's something interesting there because it is still a matter of, look, maybe the films weren't put together as well. Maybe the writing wasn't as interesting or as clever. Maybe the performances just didn't do it. But there's still some interesting ideas behind those other films. And so that's where, I've been watching some of that. I want to talk about that maybe in a later episode, but it leads me into why I started going down that road. And that was because of these two films that I just saw recently this year that I think they have traces of that era of filmmaking, but there's something about them that it doesn't quite feel the same. It just feels different. It's a different time. Filmmaking has changed. Storytelling has changed. Just the world in general has changed. So watching these two more recent films, The Hunger Games, A Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, that is, of course, that is a prequel to the Hunger Games films from about 10 years ago, based on a series of novels, right? And I watched Furiosa, a Mad Max Saga, which is also a prequel to Mad Max Fury Road, which is also a sequel to those films from the 80s, Mad Max 2, The Road Warrior, and then Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome. Very influential and very key to another wave of films like that. I feel like if you really look at it, you've got Star Wars that sets off the whole like space opera, science fiction, fantasy sort of thing. Then you've got Mad Max, which sets off a whole run of the post-apocalyptic wasteland stories and films that come after that. And of course, there's a lot of understanding that was based on A Boy and His Dog, which I talked about in a previous episode a while back. I could see the influence. I just didn't think that was a particularly strong film. I could get why there's some interesting ideas in there and maybe some reason to iterate, but I think Mad Max really nails it and makes it something that is much more timeless. But all of that to say, like these more recent films that kind of live in that same genre, I think there's something just very different about them. And I don't know what it is necessarily, but I wanted to talk about them a little bit because here, this Hunger Games prequel, it focuses on this world of Panem and the younger version of what's his name? Coriolanus Snow. Is that his name? That's not a name. Come on. I know it's a Shakespeare thing. I know, but still, this character, we see him at a much younger age, and we see not really the beginnings of the Hunger Games, but we see when the Hunger Games as a concept, as an event in this world where the balance of our society can be made or broken by how this thing comes off. I don't know. I feel like the whole concept is pretty dystopian. This idea of an annual competition where 12 children are pitted against each other to the death, right? Yes, of course, it's based on Battle Royale and other stories that have come in the past, whatever. But this, in this kind of contained bubble of the Hunger Games world or whatever, this film, it tries to set up some things, which I guess are useful if you remember or if you've seen the original films, that might inform some of how things happen in those stories. But in this story, this, honestly, it's kind of like two movies in one. It's two stories, really. You've got the beginnings of Snow and his sort of place in all of this, right? Like, he's not a president. He's not in a place of power or real influence, but we do see him and other people, other characters kind of grappling with the evolution of the games, like what it is becoming. And as part of this, he becomes a mentor to Lucy Gray, who is a new competitor for this year's games. And that's where we're introduced to the idea of the mentorship and the sponsors and how it's not just the person thrown into the competition, it's the people behind them and how their influence can sway things, right? That's all a pretty significant story. Like, just setting that up, like helping build out that world a little more, or the history of that world, right? And yet at the same time, there's this other kind of like romantic angle, this love story that's happening. And the second half of the movie essentially becomes them escaping Panem and finding a way to potentially make a difference, even though it turns out to not be that, right? Because we know the other films happen later. So, the thing is, like, I feel like it's kind of an unnecessary prequel. I don't really understand the idea behind this story, other than to just show us more of this character who, in the original films, was essentially just a monster. And now we kind of see, like, well, he was a human being, and slowly and gradually things changed because of different circumstances. And I mean, I get that. Honestly, here's what I say. This film, it dilutes the earlier films. And even those films, they're kind of uneven too, I remember watching those, the original Hunger Games films. And the first one, I was intrigued by the concept. I thought it was well done. But I got to admit, whenever that first film came out, what was that, like 2010 or 12, something like that? Like, I wasn't on the Jennifer Lawrence train. I didn't get it. But, I just felt like that character and her portrayal of the character, it didn't really work for me. Something about Katniss just being so stiff and wooden and unlikable. And I get that is the way it's written, but I felt like it made it hard for me as a viewer to kind of really want her to succeed, right? And yet, there's something about it that works in a bigger scale of not just this one character, but this world. Like, the world in these stories is pretty well developed. I mean, there's so many like different rules about how things work and how society works. And in this film, I got to give it to this prequel, we at least get a little bit better idea of the geography of Panem, right? These 12 or 13 colonies and how they're all laid out, like across the continent of North America. That's the thing, is like, this is not some other world. This is not purely fantasy. This is still based on the world we know in some other sort of alternate dystopian future, right? And so getting some more clarity on that, I think, helps. I still think personally, Catching Fire, the second film in the original series, I still think that was the one that really worked the best for me personally. I feel like everything really connected on that. Even the idea of taking the games bigger, right? Making the competition itself even more of a challenge, but also throwing in the wrinkles. And, by the time we get to the fourth film, it becomes basically a war movie. So I think that's where, it kind of shifts, because the story has to have some progression. We got to get these characters into this certain situation. They're going to take down this president and this way of living and this whole society. So it can't just be these games over and over. I get that. But this one, the prequel, this is interesting too. Like, it's directed by the same director as the last three Hunger Games movies, Francis Lawrence. And yet this film feels so different. And part of it, I feel like, maybe is the way that it's shot, the way that it's edited. There's just something that feels not as, I don't know, cinematic, not as in line. It doesn't feel consistent with those earlier films. And maybe it's not supposed to. Maybe it's supposed to feel different. And I even say this much. Like, I get the idea that in the original story, there are a couple moments where Katniss sings a song, and it's meant to indicate like her emotions, but also connect with people like in the story, but also connect with the audience. But in this film, there is too much singing. Like, this almost becomes a musical, I feel like. Like, it's so performative. And, I don't know the lead actress in this, Rachel Zegler, I think. I from what I understand, I guess she's got like a musical background, something like that. Cool. But the music in this film, the singing, the musical numbers in this, they're so showy. They're so singy that it just took me out of the film. I'm like, this is not what I thought it was going to be. I could say, well, I see the point of showing a time for these characters, for this world, where things were a little more joyous or celebratory, I guess, by having this more exuberant kind of show going on. How you like all these $50 words I'm dropping? What I'm saying, though, is you're still in the world of the Hunger Games. Like, people kind of are able to look past that whole thing, much less the rest of the way the world is working, to think like, yeah, we still enjoy music. I just don't know. It just feels like a weird, like, counterproductive move. To me, it connects more with the original film, where the song, those moments where Katniss sings, they're quiet and they are subtle. The way I read it is that we can't really enjoy this kind of thing, but we need something. We're gonna eke some kind of moment out of this with just this quiet, gentle song. We don't have a band. We're not doing dance moves. We're not we're not on a stage. It kind of goes against what I thought was the idea, the whole genesis of these stories. And so, all those things said, like, I don't know if this film really works for me. I get what it's trying to do, kind of build this up a little bit more of a history with this world, and kind of connected in a couple of ways to the original films. I don't know if there's going to be another film after this, because like I said, this is kind of two films in one. It is actually kind of long. It's like over 2.5 hours, if I remember right. And If this is all we need, this is all we get, I'm fine with that. If there's another film coming after this, which maybe, I mean, I guess I could see that somehow, but I really don't know where you would go then. And that's always the trouble with these prequels, especially these kind of legacy prequels that jump way back ahead of films that we've sat with and we've gotten to know for so long. Now, The Hunger Games is, of course, a relatively new series, franchise, whatever, but something like Mad Max, that film's been around since the 70s. So to think like, okay, here's a film in Furiosa that it's not a prequel to those films. It is a prequel to Fury Road. So Fury Road, there's a pretty big jump between Thunderdome and Fury Road, right? Somewhere in there is Furiosa. Now, by one moment in Furiosa, I think we're supposed to imply like it's what 10 years or so before Fury Road. Like it kind of happens in a place where we see Max for one shot. He's in the distance, and yet he looks probably most like the way we saw him at the end of Road Warrior. If I had to pinpoint it, I would say probably somewhere after Road Warrior. I'm not clear where this falls around Thunderdome. So make of that what you will, I guess, right? But again, we only see him from a distance, and it's only for one moment in the film. Otherwise, this really is about Furiosa, and it's about her development from being a young girl in her home to being taken from that home and kind of being passed around, being a part of this power struggle between these different groups, these warring bands, whether it's Dementis, who, talk about that in a minute, who originally takes her, or if it's Immortan Joe, who, of course, has the Citadel, has all of those people that we saw in place during Fury Road. So we kind of revisit that for a part of this film. And a location, a group that I don't remember seeing or hearing about in Fury Road, but that is the Bullet Farmers. I take it back. I do remember we saw a character from there, but we didn't see the location. So we've got this power struggle going on between these three groups, these three territories. And Dementis, who is the leader of this gang of bikers, basically just roaming the wasteland, he's the one that finds Furiosa as a young girl and takes her in, and it doesn't take her in in a friendly way either. It kills her mother, and basically they try to find her homeland, which is this the green place. And so part of their journey is trying to find where this place is, but in the meantime encountering these other groups and trying to take them over. Tries to do that with Immortan Joe at the Citadel. Doesn't work out so well. He goes to Gastown, is able to make something happen there, takes that over. And, I got to say, as much as this film is about Furiosa and she is the main character and we're following her journey through this film, Chris Hemsworth in this as Dementis is doing work. I mean, this film is kind of also his film too. He kind of steals the show. And he is the villain, or he is one of the villains, but also he is probably the one that you are most interested in knowing what's going to happen to him. Because we kind of already know what's going to happen with Furiosa, right? We're just kind of waiting for certain things to fall in place. We essentially know where she's going to end up because we've seen Fury Road. With Dementis, it's different because on one hand, I'm like, where did this character come out of from the earlier films? You know what I'm saying? Where did this gang of bikers and where did he come from that world? And for most of this film, I'm wondering, how is this character going to come back if there's another film after Fury Road? How are we going to see this character again? That question is answered by the end of Furiosa, But I really thought, well, there's no way this is a character that we just see for this one moment in time when he takes her and trades her to Immortan Joe. I really thought, oh, okay, this is going to be a character. I got to know more about what happens to this character. And turns out he's in the entire film. And I tell you, he just steals every scene. He's doing a lot of work. He's got makeup on. He's got this whole look to him. He's got this accent, this really heavy kind of country Australian accent. I don't know what the right word for it would be. It doesn't sound very sophisticated or contemporary, but it's doing something different, you know? And I think, of course, that is what these films are all about. That's George Miller's sort of sensibility, I think, is like take a weird thing and twist it and turn it and make it even weirder. Why not? And I think that's part of the appeal of these stories and this setting is that you can do whatever. There are no rules here. And so this, I'll say this, it gives us a really interesting villain and a dynamic with that character and the other villains in the film. It gives us a more, a kind of a better overview of the landscape, the layout of the Wasteland, even geographically pinpointing it for us, right? Like at the beginning of the film, there's a shot that actually shows us where this is all happening, which I think for the previous 4 films, we kind of have an idea, but it's never really clear. It's never really entirely pointed out. And yet for those things that it does right or does well, I think there's something lacking about Furiosa herself as a character here. Because, think about for most of this film, the character doesn't speak. She's a young girl taken from her home. Her mother is killed. So she's traumatized, but also she is angry. And yet she has this knowledge of where this place is. So she's not giving up that knowledge. So she doesn't talk. She doesn't want to tell anybody anything. And so for most of the scenes that we see her as a young girl, she has no dialogue. And it's not until we see her older, where Anya Taylor-Joy comes in, she starts to have dialogue, but there's still that sense of like this character is shut off. This character is not giving up anything. And so there's no real emoting from this character. She's just kind of dead inside. And I get that. That's part of the arc of the character from when we get from here to Fury Road, where we see a character who is really hungry for freedom and willing to risk it all, and even breaks down at the moment when that's all gone, right? Like we see the real fury come out of her. In this film, it's just kind of, it's way under the surface. It's all just brewing down there, and we don't really get a lot of that. And that's where I feel like, man, it kind of didn't make this character the same character that's in Fury Road. And part of it, I might say, is performance, but I think a lot of it is just the writing of it, of like, this character is not supposed to show us much. But I think that's what worked in Fury Road. It's like we got to see the character be a total badass. And there's some of that in this film, but it's not to the same level, So even that stuff aside, like, there's some issues with the film here that just took me out of it. So much of this series, this franchise, is built on the action in it, right? And the action being tactile and real and visceral. And there are moments like that in this film, but there are just as many moments and shots and sequences where there's a ton of CGI work going on. And it's obvious CGI work. And, if there were, and I know there was some work like that in Fury Road, but it was so well, I guess, hidden or used that it wasn't obvious. But in this film, man, you can see it. You can see like, oh, this character's on a stage and that background's not really there. They're not out in the desert. They're not in this place that they're supposed to be at. You can tell, oh, that's not a real vehicle. That's not real people that are falling off of that onto the ground. And you could say, well, there's so much going on in this, you can't really pay attention to it all, but come on. I mean, it's not like Fury Road came out last year. This wasn't rushed. So I don't know. I don't know what this means. If we do get another film, like I really want to see something that goes back to the kind of just actually kind of scary level of action and stunts and special effects. I remember that's still something I think about with Fury Road. When I saw that, when it came out, and some of the stuff that happens in that film, and I just really thought, like, there is no way no one got hurt making this movie. It just looks so convincing and so dangerous and irresponsible. And I think that's something that, even if it is fake and even if it is safe, compared to when the original films were made, like 70s and 80s, there's something about those films that I think it replicated, which is that, yeah, we're kind of really living on the edge making this film. And it's something that comes through. It comes through the screen of like, that looks terrifying, what I just saw. Not because it's like even gory or graphic, but just that the notion of like somebody's doing that. Like that's an actual person doing that. And this film, there are a couple moments, but a lot of it just feels fake. And I just don't like that for this world. This world, I feel like it's got to feel real. It's got to feel like the stakes are at their highest at all times, because that's kind of that's the deal. I like the idea of exploring this character, of, showing us Furiosa's story, showing us a little more of the world, or maybe a lot more of the world, and even giving us a real villain that we could kind of actually get behind in a sense, right? We don't want him to ultimately win, but we do want to see him for more than just 20 minutes in the film. So I don't know. I'm kind of mixed feelings on it. Maybe I need to watch it again at some point, and maybe watch it back to back with Fury Road or something to just get a sense of how they connect better. Or maybe that's the wrong way to go. I don't know. But that's kind of where I'm at. And so look, with these two films in mind, like I said, I've been going back. It's funny. A lot of films I've been talking about more recently, they are from that era of like the 70s, let's say like 75 through 95, right? There's like a 20-year period in there where I think filmmaking changed a couple of times, right? Whether you have something like Jaws or Star Wars that invented the Hollywood blockbuster and invented these kind of big swing special effects driven tentpole films. And then you get to something like Raiders of the Lost Ark, you get to E.T., which explore not just blockbuster territory, but like real emotional and adventurous types of stories with characters we really want to see succeed, right? Then you get to films like the early 90s, you've got Terminator 2, you've got Jurassic Park, which change filmmaking, just the technology of filmmaking, in ways that, I mean, we still see the effects of now. And all of those films, I think, all those films I just named, I think they all spawned their own waves of copycats. I mean, you see it. I think that era right in there, that pocket, that's where we saw so much change in how films were made and what kinds of stories were being told. And maybe it's for the worst, because I feel like there are a lot of films before those in the 60s and 70s, those types of stories, we probably don't get as many of them anymore. And there's probably ways that they could be done better today, But I'm just saying that 20-year period, I think there's a lot of ground in there. And as much as I feel like that was kind of when I grew up too, especially in the 80s and 90s. That's why I was watching films, like paying attention. But I think now, being able to look back in hindsight and see like, oh, here's a film that I never saw, just somehow missed it. Or like, here's a film I did see, but I didn't understand that. I didn't recognize the significance, or I didn't really see what it was doing. that's been a big, kind of an interesting road to go down. So I do want to talk about that. Some films I've got from that era, maybe in the next episode, maybe in a future episode. But yeah, I don't know. Hunger Games, Mad Max, those franchises, I think in some ways, those franchises are better left where they are now. Let's just call it. Let's move on to something new. These prequels, I don't know if they really worked out the way they were intended to. And it's not to say they're entirely bad, but I feel like there's some things that could have been better. So anyway, that's it for me. That's it for this episode. If you want to check out some others, filmstreak.com. You can find other episodes. You can find, you know what? So I have the list of all these films on IMDb. I also found this other thing. And look, it's totally up to you. It's no pressure, but I got to mention it because I'm adding it to the website. And that is this thing where, hey, you know, I do this for free. I do this for fun. So if you appreciate this, buy me a popcorn. That's all. I've toyed with the idea of like, do I make some of this somehow paid content or whatever? I don't want to do that. I don't want to have ads and sponsors and all that. But, you know, hey, you got $5, you want to buy me a popcorn? That's cool. If not, that's all right. I'm going to keep going. So that's up there too, if you feel like it. So look, hey, summer's here. It's hurricane season. So it's hot. It could be dangerous, could be wet. Find you somewhere nice and cold, pour you a cold drink, and go watch something new.